Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming today. This there we go. Can you all see that? Got this. Hold on a second. Got the screen sharing thing right in the middle of my presentation. Why is it doing this? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And today I'm going to be working on some ideas that I've been processing since getting involved with STP a few years ago, and trying to digest and kind of bring together the variety of theoretical frameworks that we've been introducing, each one of which I think adds a lot to the conversation. But I'm finding, particularly in kind of classical political questions, that the combination of our theory of modes, our kind of organizational Trinitarianism, and then our theory of social mediation kind of come together to provide a really powerful mapping for questions of political strategy and experimentation. And so I try to develop these ideas in just some kind of simple directions in order to try to give a sense of what it would look like to turn this into political methodology. I've got this kind of fantasy. I don't know if it's like the best way forward, but I got this idea that instead of like a manifesto or something, we'd publish more like a manual. That would just be like how organization works, how like these little diagrams come together to make something useful. And part of the conversation is going to be kind of like split between two perspectives. Like I do think a lot of what I'm going to say applies internationally at the moment, particularly some of the things I'm going to be bringing up about cooperatives. But I also have been asking a lot of these questions from the perspective of doing politics in the United States right now, and how our perspective on organizations helps to understand why so much classical left-wing political strategy, especially things like independent left-wing parties, have failed miserably in the United States, and also how we can leverage aspects of bourgeois society in the US to actually push forward different kinds of organizational methods. And this will all kind of tie back to the on the one hand, critique of federalism, and on the other, like the idea of cooperatives as a political organization of the moment, if you will. So this is the general idea. I'm also, like Gabriel said before, I've got a kind of a non-linear Venetian snare style of presentation. So this is kind of going to detour and tie together. I think it ties into a knot at the end, or something like that. But I'm going to ask that I kind of do the hour-long presentation and then break and then conversation after, because I get derailed easily. And there's a lot of, admittedly, there's a lot of points to draw questions throughout this, and I'm very open to critique and feedback and blah blah blah. Just please at the end. So, and throughout this, I'm going to be kind of trying to approach our work along with some of the other kind of thinkers of kind of relational ontology. Badiou's huge for this group. Rosen's influential. I've also been working a lot with Roy Bhaskar. But also trying to think through kind of these three classic kind of Marxist socialist positions: the question of internationalism, the question of what like a proletariat fighting organization looks like, and then the last point is specific to the U.S. So I'm not saying it doesn't apply anywhere, but this is where I'm thinking in terms of the U.S., which is the socialist leadership of the liberal struggle. For anyone that's been noting, we're losing quite badly right now. Basic liberal rights in the United States, let alone anything socialist. So, all right. So this is where we're going to go. I think I've got the right setting. Yes, I do. Okay. So I'm going to start here with our good friend Robert Rosen, and an idea that he proposes of formal experimentation, which essentially asks, if you take any object or any situation and you analyze it, Rosen says there's a lot of cool ways that math and science gives us to break things up into parts. However, the full test of whether or not you have a good model is whether you can then recompose those parts through synthesis back into the thing that you're analyzing. And so essentially you can ask the question, is this diagram between the identity map of what you're studying and the process of analysis and synthesis, do they commute? And this would be, for me, the simplest way we can characterize any kind of formal approach. And then when we ask the question of synthesis, that depends on, are we in the field of science or politics or anything else? Here, of course, we're talking about politics. So while we want our theories to be valid, I am trying to kind of stick to some of the distinctions between politics and science that this group uses. I also have some differences, I think, there, which may or may not come up. So I'm not going to go into that at the moment. But this is going to be my general kind of criterion. We have multiple ways in this group of kind of breaking things into parts: modes A, mode B, mode C, intelligibility, interaction, composition, individual, social, mediation, world. So the question is, we have some amazing analytic frameworks. What is the political synthesis of bringing these kind of back together into a cogent political strategic kind of alignment? And this is where I'd like to propose my own definition in all this. I think it's probably one of the only actual definitions or introductions, and not just kind of working over things that we already have, which is the definition of an institution, which has, I would say, a bit of a actually Lacanian feel to it, in the sense that the way I've been really conceiving of institutions is as knots between the modes. That what an institution does, and this can be something as like sophisticated, complex as a body of law and a Supreme Court that is interpreting it, or it can be as simple as like a small restaurant, or a which can be defined by private ownership or cooperative ownership, which I'll get into later. Institutions could be things like a small group of people playing games and the rules that form around that. It can be an entire nation state or global economy. So I want to give a lot of scale sensitivity to the notion of institution, but what separates it from organizations more generally is the idea that it takes these three transcendentals and in some form or another ties a knot that enables something to continue to persist in our actual social world. And this is what I'm going to call case synthesis. And so case synthesis is when we take these different logics, and of course we've been exploring them predominantly under the form of topology. So when we're thinking about things in terms of open sets, closed sets, different kinds of boundaries, different kind of exchanges between different kinds of boundaries, we're still ultimately like tying this back together into some kind of organizational entity that is capable of mediating all of these different modal logics in a way that is effective, right? Like that meets the task that has to be done in any given day. You got to feed yourself, you got to keep the power going, or you got to like fill out the completely weird, abstract, bureaucratic paperwork that doesn't make sense to you, but somewhere else in the process it does. It doesn't really matter whether or not, and I think this is one of the main breakthroughs of this group, whether or not this process of case synthesis makes sense to any given individual within that group. Bureaucracies, and like Kafka is a classic reference point here, from the individual perspective, bureaucracies make no sense. They're absolutely absurd, and they're actually kind of terrifying. What I would argue is when we kind of extrapolate out, we can begin to see the logic of bureaucracy or any other kind of institution from the impersonal perspective of its case synthesis. How is it tied together the different modes into a concrete way that enables it to negotiate the various kind of challenges that are existing at that time in society? So when we then take the step from there to this, I'm going to come back. There's some stuff about covariance and contravariance I want to come back to later. But I do want to propose that what we think of as mode D, which is this kind of liberated position or emancipated position of organization, as opposed to the kind of Karatanian perspective that it most resonates with mode A, that of any of the three modes, it's the mode A is the most emancipated like. I would like to argue against that, that any of the three modes in and of itself can be quite problematic, and that the mode D is actually what nothing but like the free or emancipated case synthesis of all of these modes. Another way to put it is it's like mode D is when people actually have the freedom to be completely creative in how we build our institutions. But this is the kind of logic of institutionality as such. But you'll see here that I kind of reference this thing, a geohistorical knot tied using the strands registers of modes A, B, and C in a concrete situation in K, and kind of threading the needle. You're kind of taking the modes and threading them. But what do I mean by these strands or registers? So I'd like to jump over to this for a second. I'm proposing here that we can actually make a Cartesian product or a table, exhaustive table between our modes and our dimensions, I'm going to call them here, of our organizational Trinitarianism. And that, again, in light of a lot of us, I think, for one way or another, owe a lot to Monsieur Lacan. And so in a bit of a gesture to him and his notion of the Borromean knots, I'm calling these 9 categories the registers, which are the ways that we can break up organizational problems according to their modes and according to the dimension of the organizational Trinitarianism. And I haven't really had a chance to kind of like begin to flesh out all the way that we could like make examples of these 9 registers. But I think whenever like you look at the composition of social movements, you can see these kind of come out. And I'm going to come back to that once I dive into the practical examples of Occupy. But I'm trying to just lay out some of the theory for a second. Now, these registers in my reading can actually be like formalized. We're going to go into more detail on this in 2 weeks, but essentially, I think you can make a case that these different things that we've been exploring, and we've kind of gotten there mostly in a lot of conversations, can be like linked to specific aspects of our organizational Trinitarianism. A few, I want to say months ago, but I think it was more like a year plus ago, lenses, optics, and their relationship to open games was a major topic of conversation in this group. And it was actually in that period that we were really beginning to look at the relationships between interaction and what at a certain point we called the compositional point of view. During this period, we kind of like shifted into this Trinitarianism and this kind of triangulation of these 3 dimensions. And recently in the work that Dennis and I've been doing, this 3rd category of open learners has come up, which kind of seems to correspond to the questions of intelligibility. So what I'm essentially proposing here is that not only can we correspond modes A, B, and C to topological spaces, but we can look at the dimensions of organization according to different ways that category theorists have chopped up information processing. All of these categories here on the left, open learners, open games, lenses, and optics, all fall under the same kind of category that Jules Hedges calls a teleological category. We're going to dig more into the mathematics of this later, but the gist of it is for Hedge, Telcat is a minimal category of agency. So if we're trying to conceptualize how to map out agency in terms of building organizations and building politics, what I'm proposing is that we can start with these 9 registers. That this is the way we can kind of like break out how people directly try to problem solve issues in politics. All right, so I've moved pretty quick there and covered a lot of things. And I'd like to take a second to kind of specify how I want to go forward from here. So there are kind of like 2 ways I've really been trying to work through this system of like stuff that I have here, which is mostly just a condensation of what this group has been working on for years. Which is to try to process a period of political experimentation between 2011 and 2014 here in Eugene, Oregon, starting with Occupy and then moving through the homeless rights movement. And then looking at 2 political strategies that I think are going to be potentially useful, and if nothing else, are interesting thought experiments. One of which is my position on co-ops, and the other of which is my position on the limits of federalism in the United States right now. But I want to try to connect these 2 things because part of the core position here, and I think part of what we're trying to work through in terms of scale sensitivity, is a lot of the critiques and ideas for kind of large scale politics that I'm going to present at the end came out of the very local contingent limits of politics that we ran into in this period of 2011 to 2014. And after that period, I got involved in, I guess you could say, more kind of orthodox, which is the nice way to put it, Marxist-Leninists, which was as every bit as bad as people say it is. So I guess I kind of was like, all right, that's not going to work. But I also would never have been, so much of our work from 2011 to 14, as I'll show, was rooted in Marxist and socialist politics. So trying to mediate the problems of dogma while still, utilizing this tradition and methodology has been a lot of the work, and a lot of what I think STP has really freed up my mind and imagination again to do politics creatively while still being connected to rigorous methodology. So just to jump into the 2011 to 2014 period, we had a kind of unique situation here in Eugene, because on the one hand, it's a smaller town with a smaller police force. On the other hand, it's got decades of activist experience and whatnot, and in particular was like a major planning place of like anti-globalization, a lot of the like hardcore of environmentalism before they got smashed by the Bush years. But there was a lot of that kind of like stuff still at play in 2011. And so there's this weird capacity for us to last longer than a lot of camps in the country and longer than any of the camps on the West Coast. Because on the one hand, the police just didn't have the forces to come sweep us out. And on the other, we actually had a pretty good cadre of experienced activists and kind of like weird little community organizers and stuff that could bring that to the table. But like any other camp anywhere, we had the basic issue of, half of it was a protest camp and the other half was a homeless camp. And that was a kind of cliche after a while, that, the reason Occupy failed was because we couldn't prioritize the real politics over, the nice philanthropy of helping homeless people, but not the real, that's not real politics. So we were told. And most of the camps that embraced that idea collapsed. Our camp embraced the idea that the homeless crisis was part and parcel of the very situation that we were protesting, and that for some of us that were reading a lot of Agamben at the time, that the camp was actually a kind of privileged political site and the kind of status of refugee, and in particular a homeless person is essentially like an economic refugee. We were able to kind of recast the problem away from its 1%, 99% to something that looked more like a class analysis. But for all that, like, the fact remained that practically speaking, we had a huge, highly, very needy population that was conflicting with the political objectives of the camp. So this is where the first concrete experiment comes in. And, here's our little diagram as well of social mediation. So the structure on the right is a very typical Occupy camp. In blue, we have the General Assembly, which, we can conceive of that as kind of organizing mode A, mode B, because you had to have the stamp of approval from the General Assembly. And if you needed any funds, you also had to be authorized because the bank account was under the aegis of the General Assembly. At the bottom, you see the committees, which formed kind of like the division of labor on the camp. And each of those committees had a set of like reporting obligations and blah, blah, blah to the General Assembly. But a lot of those committees, and if you kind of like take a look, medical and kitchen, for example, most of the work done by that actually was servicing people who were homeless. Other committees, for example, the comms committee, which predominantly handled media, was very little involved with homeless folks. So the major innovation that we introduced that as far as I know, did not happen anywhere else in the country, so I think this was a positive experiment on our part, was to introduce what we call the Camp Council. And the Camp Council was limited to people who lived on the camp. They were the only ones who could speak or could vote. And they were able to absorb a certain amount of the logistics of the camp into their purview. Things that didn't have to do with life at the camp, for example, media and comms, remained completely under the responsibility of the General Assembly. But things that more or less impinged predominantly on the lives of those that lived there, another critical committee was the garbage committee. Those were increasingly kind of integrated into the camp council. And what was important is that this council was not just some like venting session for the poor people while the real activists did the blah, blah, blah. Like they actually took over a considerable amount of the management structure of life in the camp. And so I think using some of our language and some of the other interests of folks in this group, there's a lot of classic leftist ways to look at these, different councils, different direct democracy. They're all useful, but I think there's another more formal and impersonal way to look at it, which is to see things like general assemblies and camp councils as interfaces. And the interface of a general assembly overall, and let's forget the whole nonsense of consensus and all that for a second, assuming it was a little bit better put together, nonetheless, a general assembly was directly addressed to the 99%, and by its very definition had to authorize, had to allow participation from anyone, the 99%. That was its strength and also its kind of weakness. By creating the camp council with very strict participatory limits and very, I would say, more explicitly defined kind of commitments to the camp, you created a kind of narrower interface, but one that had more specific kind of obligations that came with it. If someone came to the camp and wanted to participate in General Assembly, they didn't even have to know anyone, right? They didn't have to contribute in any way. The whole kind of premise was that this was an open movement to everyone. But that's not really democracy for people who are actually living at the camp, right? It's one of those kind of false things to equivocate between someone who's desperately trying to hang on living at a camp and some person that comes along to air their grievances about capitalism. And so by kind of chopping up those domains of problems, we were actually able to, within a period of a couple of weeks after we instituted that, stabilize most of the internal dynamics of the camp. It was pretty remarkable what happened once this camp council got off the ground. And shortly thereafter, the police started more classic sabotage and ultimately got shut down. But I still think that this was a pretty critical experiment. And I think this is one of the places that shows the importance of this model in particular right here. The General Assembly was one particular kind of we could think of Occupy as a whole as a social mediation, but then we could zoom into these various different levels, right? If we conceive of life at the camp as the social world, in this case, the committees or the General Assemblies were the social mediations. And so we had to introduce a new kind of social mediation that offered different kinds of constraints. You had to live at the camp and reduce problems in different kind of ways. These weren't explicitly political problems to be addressed to the powers that be or whatnot. These were reductions of real life, day-to-day garbage getting taken out, food getting met, right? So it was a processing of information in a different kind of way, which was not only effective for the people on the camp to get their needs met, but it offloaded those kind of questions from the General Assembly. I would like to say that made the General Assembly more efficient. That is not true. Again, due to things like consensus and other inherently dysfunctional methodologies, but it did actually take away a lot of the tension that had been developing between solving day-to-day reproductive questions of life and kind of the larger scale political questions of Occupy. So I think this is a case where, the politics involved was in not so much trying to stick to what is the real politics versus the non-politics of the situation. I like the idea of politics being a diagonal that cuts across society. The politics was rather in identifying a real place. Amelia kind of talked about this in her presentation last week, right? Real kind of choke points, real kind of places where the democratic process was breaking down. And then to develop a new kind of social mediation or interface that enabled those problems to be broken up and kind of reprocessed in a different way to like solve the problems more effectively. And so I think one of the things to emphasize coming out of that is like, we should be like, I remember saying early on, I like mediation. I like that word. I want to keep it, and that remains the case. But I think it's important to remember that social mediations can be intentionally produced. They don't always have to be this kind of like huge geisty historical thing that we have no say in, or it's all like, obviously things, when you build a camp council or general assembly, they can definitely get a life of their own. But that doesn't mean you cannot more or less politically like initiate certain forms of social mediation. And I think that a lot of our theory helps to structure that process, right? Because to go back to the question of the registers, right? There were multiple ways, for example, to break up the problems of interaction on the camp, right? There were all the interactions that were formed by people who, say, shared the same kind of labor, the medical crews, the garbage crews, that looks a lot like a kind of free associative mode C. There are also all the like actual like cliques and little communities, which really, these were the things that kept people's spirits up and kept people like affectively engaged. And so we kind of think of this as interaction conceived on mode A. And the problem became, in many ways, how do people interact at the level of mode B when mode B was just the General Assembly? We didn't have the right kind of ways to break up problems that came at the level of protocol, infrastructure, regulation, the kind of things that naturally come up at like, quote, state-like systems within one single organization. And I mean, the division of powers is something that pretty much every large scale political entity has had to do. So this is not new, but it showed that on a small local level, division of powers, division of responsibilities, and construction of new political interfaces can really change much larger dynamics. So this experiment was something that like affected a lot of us. And when we got shut down, we really remained committed to the idea that homeless camps that were autonomous and in which people could like take control of their lives were, in lieu of a country that won't give housing to homeless people, like the best political situation we could come up with. And at the time, in the wake of Occupy, so let's just say from 2012 on, camping was illegal in Eugene. And you had thousands of homeless people who were constantly being harassed by police and private security under the aegis of this law that banned camping anywhere in the city. And behind it, there's just a huge amount of hatred for homeless people in the community here. And essentially a human rights campaign developed, which took many dimensions, but we couldn't really get forward on actually getting camps open. That we knew so many homeless people, there was no place for them to be. It was the same stories of being kicked around the city over and over again. And so one particular person who has a great mind for law and strategy came up with what I'm going to call hacking the American federal system. So what do I mean by that? The American federal system is kind of weird. In the United States, the 50 states of the Union are not completely subordinate regional governments like most regional governments around the world. They remain pseudo-sovereign entities, which is why governors can pardon people who are given the death penalty in state law, and also why everything from slavery to anti-trans legislation has always been pushed at the state line. In the United States, federalism and states' rights are the ultimate trenches of reaction, hatred, counter-revolution, all that jazz. And that plays out beyond, like, the fundamental distinction is the federal government versus the state government, but this plays out into other ways that municipality and city governments are organized. And then our smallest kind of regional unit, counties, county commissioners have immense undemocratic powers in this country, and have had since the founding of the federal government, the Constitution. However, these are all very distinct and very non-cooperative levels of government, and each one of them owns different parcels of land. Each one of them has different laws and limits about how long people can stay on that land. So essentially, there's been enough human rights legislation around homeless folks in the United States that police have to give people a certain amount of notice before they get kicked off of a piece of land here. And it's anywhere, depending on whether or not you're in city land, county, state, or ODOT, which is the Oregon Department of Transportation, its own kind of legal entity, 24 to 72 hours. The strategy that this person came up with was to essentially put together a committed group of homeless folks. We had about 20 or 30 really hardcores. And we would go to one piece of land under one bureaucratic type. We would get the notice, and then we'd move to an entirely different kind of land. So we bounce from state to county to city to ODOT to county to state to municipal. Each one of these entities directly contracted the Eugene Police Department, but each one of them had different ways of contacting them. Each one had different conditions on how long people had to be given notice. If it was city land, I believe it was 24 hours. If it was county, it was 72, blah, blah, blah. And essentially this meant that the Eugene Police Department was constantly chasing around these camps, but under the commands of 4 different distinct government entities, each of which owned that land separately from the other. And this went on for 4 months, 5 months. I can't quite remember. And essentially, like, we wore the city down. We bounced around so many places that we eventually were able to establish a camp called Whoville, which lasted for about 7 months before the police shut it down again. And again, demonstrated that because it had quite a bit of democratic practice and self-management, and a lot of people not only like lived better lives, but actually you began to see things like mental health get better and stuff. It was pretty amazing. For the materialist Christians in the group, you could say it's miraculous. But the whole policy hinged on the fact that these government entities kind of are pitted against each other under the American federal system. The problem is the very thing that we were able to use against the Eugene Police Department is an exception to the rule, because generally speaking, these things are used against us. And so I think this is an interesting experiment for a lot of reasons. First off, I just came back to Eugene like in the last year, and I found out that there are now tons of legal pseudo self-administered camps throughout the city. So like we actually like had an effect, which I didn't know. I was much more pessimistic. So that was kind of a nice find that we actually had some effects. But also it was a kind of variant in the exploration by perturbation or disturbance of the American federal system. I do strongly believe that there's a reason there's never been a successful left-wing third party in the United States. I don't think it's just like they didn't have the right brand of Marxism or whatever. I think our system is like about as effective as like an old feudal system of keeping out socialist party politics. And so it's not really comparable, right? Like there are a lot of ideas, coming out of like, say, the Russian Revolution, this idea of translating the Russian experience into Europe. There have been so many attempts to similarly translate various experiences into the United States. And I think one of the things that our method is really driving home to me is that you can't really compare. I mean, there's lots of obvious reasons why, but I think one of the main things that's been underestimated is just the United States government is structured so differently than other governments, than the capacity for left-wing parties to organize predominantly around the question of state power is more or less impossible in the United States. Not that parties don't have a role. I don't believe they have the leading role. So this comes to my very, very awesome diagram. When I use really rigorous terms like A-ish and B-ish and C-ish to describe things. These happen to be my main like interest right now. Agroecology comes out of Cuba and is prominent in Latin America right now. Cybernetics speaks for itself, and cooperativism. And the basic proposal is this, but I'm going to just give an example rather than try to flesh out some of the theory for a second. Let's say, right, like we have a large scale precariat that has been forced to onload themselves pretty much all the real material risks of and ownership of, say, like a courier service or a car driving service. You're required to own the cars, you're required to provide the insurance, you're required to self-schedule and self-manage. Pretty much the only thing that is provided is an app service and the marketing that comes with that, which is to say there's very little actual capital held in the first place by the companies, which has always been one of the major obstacles to cooperativization. So what if you could suddenly build a competitive app which was based upon, equity ownership by that precariat? It would have an effect where, by the very same token of them moving over, they would undermine precisely the market of the privately owned field. And they could do it quite competitively because they wouldn't have to ensure profit to shareholders. I think Uber in the United States, I just saw, was valued at something like 70 or $80 billion for a company that has offloaded the ownership of cars, insurance of cars, all the maintenance, everything to their staff. All they provide at this point is the digital infrastructure. So I think that there are a lot of examples like that of things where neoliberal capitalism has done such a job of like trying to cut costs that it actually has made the private sector of it all kind of like increasingly obsolete or at least potentially challengeable. Obviously, that doesn't play against all industries, but I think there are opportunities to start getting worker-owned cooperatives off the ground. Now, the theory behind this is, I think, especially when you look at the 1920s in Russia and the various economic experiments, I think you can make the case that parties are not necessarily the best for sensing economic questions. And that something like a worker-owned cooperative in our theory of modes is actually better able to detect and kind of like organize questions. They may still be like large national, even nationalized enterprises. And this isn't to say that this isn't what the Bolsheviks or anything didn't want to see. The Civil War put a break on a lot of things. But the fact is, we have a lot of evidence that parties and states don't solve economic problems well by themselves. And so I think one basic argument is that the difference between like the old idea of a Leninist fighting organization and any particular instantiation like a union or a party or a co-op or anything else, right? Like we can still make the case that we need to fight at various levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, the party is the essential form par excellence. And in fact, right, when we can actually talk about organizing worker-owned enterprises to take market share from capitalists and transform it directly into worker-owned companies, this I'm not saying that these are going to be ideal things, but they can definitely be advances and provide real opportunities for people to like make a living in the here and now. So that's one of these ideas. The other that comes out of all this is the old idea of constitutions. I think in the United States, there's going to be like a breaking point soon, and there's going to be a case to be made, increasingly is being made, if you on the social media sphere, that like our constitution is simply incapable of addressing the world today. And I don't necessarily agree with Karatani that like the United Nations is like the place we should focus our energy, but I do think I agree with his sentiment that the nation state is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. And socialists are going to have to organize within the context of an international system of nation states. And so I think right now, the old questions of like federalism versus centralization, larger states versus smaller states, these are all things that within the context of the United States, the overall collapse of the US, if that's really what's happening, if we're looking at large scale kind of destabilization, at this point, I truly believe will only benefit the right. Whereas I believe the left would be most benefit by like kind of adopting or readopting the old Leninist position of leading the liberal struggle But I think the radicalism would be in proposing a new constitution. And a new constitution, in turn, I think needs to be informed by this field of cybernetics. Because really, like, from a media perspective, constitutions emerged in a time of paper and pen and publishing and printing. And obviously, in the age of the internet and AI and parallel processing and networking, it doesn't make any sense. But I'm not convinced that we have the capacities or powers to like jump into full on communism, as great as that would be. And so I think here in the US, when we look at like hundreds of bills that have been passed in the last few years attacking trans rights, and that's just one of the many assaults that are going on at the state level. And just the abject failure of the left to organize organizationally, right? There have been mass movements that have done great things, but organizations have a terrible history in the United States of being smashed and broken up and have no staying power. And I think that looking at a different kind of perspective on how to approach the United States from within, because a lot of the left is focused on, well, you know, the United States is A, the epicenter of imperialism, true. B, the United States is a state, and we're left-wingers, so we're anti-state and we're anti-imperialist, and these are all true. So any kind of reform to the states in its core structure, right? Like we can fight for healthcare, we can fight for human rights, we can fight for workers' rights, but any kind of concern about the organization of the state itself is kind of like a waste of time, if not outright betrayal of the like commitment to the worker state. I think we're at a point where the US state system is going to break one way or the other. And I don't think the left is prepared for fracturization in the United States of the country. And I don't think the Democrats are up to anything. So this is just a question, right? Because this is all kind of crazy. I've just been talking crazy now about this constitutional stuff. But I think it's part of a larger question of like, how do you actually link together all these different movements in the United States right now? To get past like just hegemonizing empty signifiers and like populist politics, I believe you need to have some kind of impersonal system to present to people as an alternative, a system that like will actually have buy-in from multiple parties, including those who don't necessarily agree with us politically or even that left wing. But in light of the crisis and the rapid escalation of extreme right-wing violence and repression. So yeah, that last point in particular, I realize can have a lot of critiques, but I'm just putting it out there as like one of many ways that I think our theory can like approach old questions and give them kind of a new theoretical framework. And also B, I think their theory helps us to see where we can be more radical or attempt more liberatory things from within like the classic reform versus revolution dynamic, right? Like we can try to propose institutions that will really increase certain kinds of freedom within the context of what'll still be a bourgeois society, without losing track of our actual kind of emancipatory politics or any of that kind of stuff. So, okay, we are coming up on the hour mark, and I think that's been crazy enough. So I'm going to go ahead and call it and say let's take 5-ish minutes and then return to let me know what y'all think of this.
Dude, can you just zoom out? I feel like there are more stuff that we didn't see in. I'm just curious.
Oh, there's the appendix over here, but
the appendix.
we didn't get into it. We don't need to get into filters right now, but
okay, I was just curious. So we take 5.
Yes, please.
Okay.
These comments are great. Oh, that's really cool. I definitely want to hear more about ST Gwen. Yeah, that's so cool. Some of these comments are amazing.
I think you ended up being actually quite, I think it took like 45 minutes because we waited like 15 to start. So it wasn't even an hour, man. It just went by so fast.
Yeah, it was quicker than I thought. I realized I missed some things, but that can go up in Q&A. It was all over the place, so I wanted to not get too far afield before we got feedback. So. Yeah, wasn't quite the nervous wreck as the last few times, so that's good.
Man, no, come on. You've perfected the Venetian snare method.
Well, now it's like this recursive loop, because now I listen to Venetian snares while I brainstorm out my presentations. So it's just like feeding back more and more. But yes. Which actually, yeah, that I listened to that music, I was like, this is kind of close to my inner monologue. So I have actually also just enjoyed that band quite a bit since you brought it up, or artist.
Man, that the green little green diagram there was just so amazing.
Yeah, I'll clean it up a bit and then share it after this.
So I just got back. Are we still on break, or
I think we're so back.
we're still back? Yeah, it was an amazing presentation, man. I really liked the connection, the threading, both the idea of the threading that you presented, but also like the threading of the diagrams that you did.
Thank you.
Could you one thing you could go back to perhaps is just I think the first thing you showed there, you mentioned that you would go back to it, and you
the contra covariant thing. Yeah. That's important, I think, and actually a big part of at least my interpretation of mode B. So yeah, let's do that. All right, it's back up. Yeah. Okay. So the idea here, like, comes largely because I look at law and contracts as case synthesis. I look at mode B transcendentally as protocol. So for one thing, just to clarify that, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from like internet protocol, because it's one of those things, either it works or it doesn't. Because remember, mode B, we model on Boolean logic, binary yes or no. Your protocol works or it does not. Or in the case of state regulation, this is the right paperwork or it's not. There isn't, like, for anyone trying to get into a country with the wrong paperwork, there is no middle ground, or any other kind of thing with the state. However, so let's talk about like HTML, HTTP, RESTful database, any real like protocols for the internet. There's been a tiny fraction of the people that are involved in using it that have been involved in creating it. And that's the basic gist of the idea of contravariance in mode B, is that you actually increase the potential for democracy by decreasing the participation. Now that can sound really elitist. And so like my basic idea would be, in like a socialist society, you'd have a threshold of skill for any given board. And then of course you'd randomize it, right? Like once you get past that threshold, I'm just going to throw my old randomize it. Democracy is solved by random. But this is like a really good case of that, because for protocols to work, really, like, they need to be as universal as possible, right? Like when you look at it's one of the few places where like big companies will agree around the world, is things like 5G cell phone. And there's always politics involved, but there's this kind of like thing where they have to agree. And in any given like regulatory body, you have to have like, you're trying to narrow down the actual regulators. So the idea is, whereas in community logic, or in the case of like a cooperative, you want to increase democracy by increasing the amount of people involved. The idea in mode B is, by having like a selective body of people create the protocol, you actually increase democracy that way. So that's what I mean by contravariance. That might not be the best term, but that's just kind of the idea I'm trying to go with. So that's why it seems like the mode B will always be inherently elitist, why states look like they're always going to be elitist. But the idea here is you could get around that by things like randomization and other aspects. So that was the idea there.
It's interesting, and I've never thought about that.
Like the example of the camp council, right? Would you say that's a case of that
Exactly.
logic with the General Assembly
Yeah.
versus
Precisely, right? Like, in order to say that it truly represented the people that live there, it had to constrain to the people that live there. Yes, yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, I saw that one also as like a case of the endogenous reproduction thesis that we came up with a while back, where the logic of reproduction of a group of people, it deviates from the logic of reproduction of the leftist organization that tries to interact with that group of people. And so that, like, in one of our texts we said that this deviation is like a problem, right? Because it sounds a lot like the General Assembly problem, where like anyone can just walk into that and say like, okay, now I'm going to participate in this thing, but my form of reproduction is not in line with those of people of the people in the camp. So the democracy becomes like diverges away from the conditions of the people that are implicated in the decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking if it wasn't the case, like, because I think that example, man, it's like such a precise, localized transformation that answers to something, and it's I don't know. I think that there's even more to flesh out in that example, and I was thinking that I loved it, but I think that I was just wondering if there isn't something. Just to see if I can, if my pen is working, if I can share with you. Just one second. I was just thinking if there isn't something that we should add, like this. Just one second. So let me just share my screen 1 second. For example, do you mind if I just share it one bit?
Do I need to stop it explicitly?
No. I think I can. I just don't want to. So this is the first moment that you were describing, right? Where you have the General Assembly, and then you have, how were we calling this, this kind of specific organs here?
Committees,
right? So you have committee 1, committee 2, committee 3, and so on. And from what I understood, like, the thing that is going on here is like information wise, right? People are just informing what should be done in these committees, right?
and resources, because the General Assembly controlled money.
Okay. So resources,
financial resources. There were direct donations to the committees, but yeah, money. There's always money, of course, right?
and command. And info, right? I mean, you can tell people what's going on. So there is actually another level here, right? Which is the actual camp, the actual occupation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And my point is, there is something here which is an enigma, right? What is the actual thing going on here? And I have the impression that to understand the movement you guys made from one structure to the other, there is, right? There is something about how this works here. Let me just add a different color, right? How this goes, how this is woven into this fabric here. This is the actual interaction between committees and the organization, right? And it seems like the more committees interact with the occupation, the more they get structured in a different way. And this no longer translates to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is something missing in the composition of this, which is prefigured in the composition of this. Because then what you presented as in the second figure is where now you have General Assembly. It needs to be split into the camp's council, right? And then this new structure here this new organization mirrors better, is better integrated with this structure, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So like it clarifies the diagram you showed us with the Rosen idea for modeling, where there is something about how this big thing here is composed originally, which doesn't allow you to decompose the committees and recompose them.
Mm-hmm.
Versus this structure here, where you can, the way that this decomposes and composes back, right, now has a more connection with this thing here. So like you can recuperate your first diagram out of this as well. You see my point? Like,
no, that's great. Yeah, yeah.
So you can act, I mean, but I think I'm not sure how we should approach this, but I know that this sounds a lot also like something Dennis was studying with this kind of, because basically what you described is this process, right? Is this one thing being split into these two things. And from the memory evolutive systems, like what is the name of this then? It's like, I forgot now. There is actually, we have a name for one big complex that divides into two and specialized, right? To actually regulate a more specific thing. I forgot how they call this, because you can either fuse, right? I forgot the name.
Yeah, I forget that this, creating a different colimit basically, right?
Yeah, and that's a direction, yeah, but exactly, like you this is literally the colimit thing, production of, right? You produce a separate colimit that actually gathers the composition of a certain pattern, which is now more individuated here. Right? So, I mean, we can actually use this example if we were to literally like develop it into, rather than one transformation. Perhaps if we find a way to redescribe it into a bunch of smaller steps, you know, because from what I gather, there is an idea originally. Sorry, I made this really mess of a diagram, but there is
there's a mess of a movement, so that's
accurate. So probably makes sense. But from what I just wanted to hear you more about this, because I have the impression that from what you're saying, there was the assumption, scission,
scission. That's it.
There was an assumption that the role of these committees was more, let's say, explicitly political, right? Like more directly, it should be debated by people who, it makes no distinction to take these decisions if you live there or if you are concerned with, political strategy more explicitly, like debating democracy in the states or whatever, as you said, right? There was, like, say, an abstract meaning of democracy, as you said. And this abstract meaning is concretized in the sense that, no, there is actually more than one meaning of democracy. Democracy in the sense of participating in your own reproduction and decisions that go into it, and democracy in the sense of, yes, anyone should be allowed to have an opinion about the state of, our politics. Like, so there is kind of a weird individuation process. Also, to go back to Caio's presentation on Simondon, right? This is kind of a weird individuation process where the ultimate form that this takes, if our theory is correct, has something to do with the contradictions that were happening between this and this, right? So you see my point? Like, there's I think we could even track these things in more detail with the stuff you presented, and sounds like a really, really good example of how these tools can track these different transformations, right?
Yeah, no, I think that that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I really like the tying it back to MES, because it really was essentially constructing a new co-regulator that could, like, kind of share the tasks and divide them out. So that makes a lot of sense, and thinking through, like, decomposing it further would be a good challenge. So I'm gonna kind of take that up and then get back to you on it. Caio.
Hey man, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. It really, I don't know if you saw in the comments, there's a lot of similarities that can be drawn out, like with the movements that happen in Brazil with regards to land and stuff. So it really seems it's something that can be traced to two places, right? It's really interesting, but we didn't know, like I personally didn't know the nuance with regards to like how it dwells in regards to law. You know, like the zigzag thing. I just started laughing in the middle, but I was like, it's just really ingenious, you know, like to have that idea and like on that threshold of legality and everything. But I wanted to ask first and foremost regarding what Gabriel mentioned, where we could perhaps see Simondon in part of it, like to what extent this working with the two orders, right? And in this case, Gabriel, you mentioned like 2 times, right? Like T1, T2. How this like to connect one from the other, this would be let's say something that is lost, that is like something that was imminent that is lost, right? Or if it's a process of loss that goes from like one order to the other, and then there is loss, like the process induces loss, or if there would be something like imminent to it, like in changing from one scale to the other. Because then like Simondon has the idea of transduction, right? So there would be a similarity within scales. So we could address things in terms of, okay, there's like more in terms of quantity, and then but in some level there is sameness. Here it seems like there is this becomes less the case, right? There is loss, but where this loss would be is where I think I'd like to know if like a transduction as a concept could perhaps help or help to notice the scales, or if perhaps the matter is somewhere else. So that's the first thing I get, like how the scales work in this term, and where the lot of let's say what is in the General Assembly and what is not in that second time, where this loss occurs. And then another question is more regarding what you mentioned in terms of the randomization. So for example, in mode B, there would be, as you mentioned, this pseudo elitism, right? Where representation would have it takes its place, and then oddly, through representation, you would be able to carry out more democracy. It's counterintuitive in that aspect. But you mentioned after a threshold is met, then randomization would take place as to ensure like proper democracy. How did this work in this concrete example? Like, where was the randomization? Where did it? Where was it installed? You know, where did it take place? Was it in like
In the Occupy
addressing?
example?
Yeah. In your concrete example, like was it in the council? Was it where did it happen?
I think so. Obviously, like randomness is a phenomenon, happens everywhere, right? On one level. So I think there was no intentional randomness, and there was a lot of counterproductive randomness, I would say. And specifically, because obviously there's just weird shit that happens. I'm not trying to like within the purview of just institutions. So much of Occupy hinged on this discourse about leaderlessness. And there were no leaders, which is weird when you were one of the leaders that wasn't a leader, blah, 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 right? It's a strange place to be in. Not necessarily bad when it comes to things like ego and whatnot, but not useful when it comes to like distributing tasks to be done, right? And so I think a lot of the randomness came up informally and accidentally, insofar as like basically we didn't have any intentional mechanism of leaders, so leaders just happened to pop up. Some folks earned trust the good old-fashioned way by like showing up and doing it. Other people had social capital coming in from other things. I'm not going to lie, those were often the hardest ones to work with. There were folks that had never been activists before that like found their own there. But the point being that like we weren't structured enough to have any intentional randomness, and the kind of randomness that came in wasn't ultimately like something we could it did not maximize democracy. It led to like cliquish little leadership groups. In fact, the kind of like Leninist backstory to the camp council was that it took quite a bit of maneuvering and kind of like Machiavellian shit to get into these little like elitist circles to push through the camp council to then get it on the camp to then actually increase democracy. So like in that like old fashioned like we're gonna like smash the backroom politics in order to make sure that like the party itself is more democratic. There was a lot of that stuff, and there shouldn't be, right? Like that's my problem. Like we shouldn't have to like play these dirty games to increase democracy, and that's where I think intentional randomness would come in. But I won't say that we had it intentional in any place.
Understood. So it would be like there's like this need for like heuristics, as it were. Like there's a manner in politics for excellence for that matter. So like having it randomness in this case would be like synonymous with spontaneity, for example, something like that. Like it happened in as much as it wasn't planned, but it wasn't something like it. It's random randomness. It's not like intentional randomness. That would be the case. But then for example, when you mentioned later on being able to address constitutional matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
This would be like some sort of like let's say an edge to have like in the different instances, again, the idea of scale in different instances to be implemented. Like, okay, for example, just to bring it a little bit to like a meta thing, like we're talking about the rotational, the coordinating position, right? For research. So is this something that intentionally we could like, this would be the idea to intentionally input randomness, like sort of like a Jacques Rancière sort of thing, like that he mentions there, like old Greek democracy, stuff like that, just taking it from, like a shortest, then implementing this and then like living up to it. That's like something you should install in different scales.
Yeah, I guess one way I think of like intentional randomness is it's kind of like an index of the resilience of a society, right? Like the more you can intentionally just kind of like institute a lottery and pick people and it doesn't lead to social collapse, the better educated, more empowered, more emancipated your society has to be, right? Obviously, in our fucked up society right now, you couldn't do that because of the inequalities of education, experience, even the capacity to work lots of different positions and try different things to get a perspective is a kind of weird privilege a lot of times in contemporary capitalism, like not being stuck at one thing over and over again. So yeah, I think like the more your society gets free, the more you should be able to introduce randomness. That being said, whether or not it's a good idea strategically for a group like ours when we have limited resources, I also think that like these kind of things work well for like regulatory bodies. I don't think like when I talk about like communities and like the actual productive space being covariant, I also don't really envision those being as random, right? Like there are times to pick someone for the job. There are some times when you're like, this person represents us where we're at right here, right now. And I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, right? But there is still a kind of constraining effect on any representation, right? Like they always like, you always have less people. So I think, so for example, like the research position, I'd be less likely to think of as random because that would probably be something that we'd want to like consciously say, this is the direction we're going in. I would think like if we could get to the place where the admin role could be more random because it's more just like day-to-day administrative, it's not to take away from the work, but it's like if all of us were capable of doing that, that would be great. I would be a disaster in that role. I'm not going to pretend, right? Like it would be
Venetian admin.
Yeah, right. It would just be a crash. So like, I think like as much as I would love to get there, and as much as I was blabbering about randomness at the last org meeting, a little sober reflection makes me a little more skeptical. tactically. Like I love it in principle, and I think it's something we should move towards.
But can I just ask something, because I think it goes back to just one point Kyle made. I just want to clarify something. Like when I added T1 and T2, those are not scales. It was just like an instant and then another, right? Like instant one, it was simpler. I think you made like a much more sophisticated point. But just two things that I think are interesting to consider, because there is a type of, I think that I've been learning a lot from John about kind of a new way to think about the state and mode B in general. I mentioned this to him already, that I had a much more commonsensical idea that whatever it is that we were to do about our theory of mode B would probably be, a description of the most solid, the most sturdy, the most kind of uncompromising, less flexible kind of thing. And the more we work on this, the more we have hints coming from the formal machinery itself that, the theory of the state that is compatible with our work on the other stuff is actually that it is a subcase of every mode, that it is, the one which has the least commitments to the upper and the lower bounds, and therefore can be hierarchically built kind of anywhere, right? So it's the most plastic and not the most sturdy or most kind of, architecturally heavy one. On the contrary, like it's communities of any size that have a big commitment to totality and explaining everything. Like you meet one person and suddenly you mediate that by an explanation about the cosmos, and capitalism, it mediates, the future of everything by like minutia detailing of, the organization of anything. Like the state can cut off and up the upper and lower bound, whatever is convenient. And it's actually therefore the most plastic. So that was the first thing I learned. And I think that you are bringing something else now with this idea of, which you described with this idea of contravariance, where there is just some like arbitrariness, therefore is very much a part of state, because there will be no minimal and upper and maximal resolution that you're obliged to cut, because you are, let's say, infinitely going up or infinitely going down. You just have to cut it. So the arbitrariness of the state already is, let's say, scale wise built into it. You just have to cut it. Who's going to cut it? It's actually a kind of meaningless, but at the same time necessary question. And then the fact that just the way that it creates scansions in space and time, with the fact that they are classical, complementary scansions, right? Before and after, inside and outside. It also means arbitrariness, because there will be no remainder for you to continue to explore. Like when you say like, you're my enemy, and then you say, yeah, but because of that you share something. So there's a deeper ground, right? It's the only mode that has no common ground, either upwards or downwards. Like there's always a price, money. It always creates an upper envelope to any division, right? There's always common ground. It's like a basis for affinity. Well, there is no common ground for the state. It's just here. Why? Because I can beat you up. Like that's enough of a justification. So arbitrariness is actually built into it, right? And then I think what's interesting in this discussion is that there's something about that is, okay, you have to do something with it. You can like almost celebrate it and I would say, verging on fetishization, because if every action is arbitrary to some level, at the level of protocols, you don't really need randomness to stage arbitrariness. Every action will be arbitrary. Somebody wins a fucking election, that's in some level arbitrary, that from now on that person is president. Like, what the fuck? Like, why? Because we can beat you up. It's not the case. So there is some level of arbitrariness that will be at stake regardless of if there is randomness or not. But what randomness does, then I think that now with your schema and with the whole discussion we've been having for ages, is we can address, which is the whole problem of sovereignty is trying to solve the connection between arbitrariness, which is structural in mode B, with the fact that it doesn't exist in mode A. Why you? It's a stupid, trivial question at the level of the state, because I can beat you up. Well, that's a good reason. I don't want to be beaten up. So, okay, it's you, you and your posse. But at the level of mode A, it's a cosmological question, because there's always common ground. And if it's you, it's actually kind of me, because I accepted you. So we're at home with that contradiction, and we are totally foreign to that arbitrariness. The sovereign, in a kind of two-body, king two bodies kind of theory, it's all about solving that. Find somebody who will bear, on the one hand, being divided into two, which will sound like an impossible contradiction at the level of the state, and the most obvious thing at the level of personhood, right? They're kind of a mediator between those two levels. But I think that once you get to like non-sovereign democracies, in the sense that sovereignty is spread out, you create a problem, because once you have the arbitrariness of a protocol established, there is nothing to mediate between that and the community which will use that protocol. So you can insert all your fantasies about the worst arbitrary fantasy capriciousness of a leader at that precise point, right? So why this protocol rather than that? I'm sure that whoever proposed that protocol wants to benefit themselves from employing it, right? So randomness becomes useful, I think, as an explicit tool in that moment, also because it makes the function of the sovereign, where nobody will be allowed to suppose excessive enjoyment on whoever bears the responsibility for deciding something arbitrary. You see my point? Like,
yeah,
it would be arbitrary anyway. And I mean, violence is, I guess, the classic justification for state, but because it works is a good pragmatic justification for applying a protocol as well. So you don't need to be violence, but because it works is also arbitrary. Like, okay, but so you guys want this rather than that. Yeah, it could be other, right? There's no reason to apply this particular bureaucracy or whatever, right? So you see my point? Like, I feel like these things start to be able to be addressed more directly. Like,
yeah, I think actually one of the hardest things it took me when I first started studying some of these protocols on like a technical level was to just truly accept they're arbitrary, that just like a room full of people decided this number means this thing, and there was no kind of like mathematical reason. They could have chosen any other index or any other symbol. Like it was hard. It was like actually kind of hard cognitively to accept that like it was just arbitrary and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, that like arbitrarity is kind of disseminated through mode B. It's very much part of or imminent to mode B. And I like that fantasy thing a lot, because that tracks a lot with, conspiracy theory generation in a lot of ways, right? It's impossible to conceive of something as just like having happened for a bunch of interconnected reasons that don't really have like a sole causality. We attribute to some people in a way that like, that makes a lot of sense. So,
and I like also that it's a non-psychoanalytic theory of problems with leadership, where you want to ask at the level of association, why am I following this rather than that? But you might only, you get a mediated access to something that is an arbitrary protocol through whoever is involved in implementing, for example, right? So you can start distinguishing these things, and that's interesting. And I when you scale up, I wonder if randomness sounds like I know it was already implemented many times as kind of something that is more scalable than having to chirurgically remove from the sort of conflict that is produced when you have too many leaderships. Kind of, you just start producing kind of either charismatic position to explain it away, right? They can do it because they represent all of us, something like this. As the only kind of other thing which is not voting and people think is legitimate, right? So But yeah, I don't know. It just sounds like a very interesting avenue to understand a bit better. And
Yeah, and I think even the way we relate to elections, like even though we, on the one hand, posit them as this like exercise of like ultimate freedom in our society, when everyone talks about them as if they're this kind of like separate entity that has its own life, and we don't really know what it's going to do, and there's like all this randomness built into. So yeah, I think that's really good. Like this idea of arbitrarity is a really good tool for B.
you know, and it makes me, I mean, I've been following this idea that I don't know how to develop more, but I mean, we spoke about this already, that it also frees up an idea of the state in the logic of, you know, big empires. That is, you can recognize why the art of politics, you know, in, you know, Chinese dynasties and things like this, why it's so developed. Like that idea that bureaucracy actually comes together with a finer look at, you know, the propensity of things, you know, and a kind of art of good analogies and kind of you know, attention to specific situations and what's the precise. It goes against a much more modern view of the state as, you know, let's just put a grid on top of everything, and
Yeah,
it's just like this heavy one value machine, you know, that just goes over everything. It also makes it more amenable to recognize it's working in situations where these things were clearly connected with a very careful kind of way of looking at things, and not like a.
yeah. I think one of those places where that idea of the state is like very one-dimensional comes out most clearly, and where the contradiction comes up the most is like in Deleuze and Guattari's notion of like the state versus the war machine. And I think that the Mongolian Empire is such a good example because they built a state from a war machine, and they were nomadic, and they built a better state than any sedentary system had ever been built at the time, which was, you know, reading that at the same time as being introduced to ideas was really like the kind of key moment for me of like, yeah, like there are so many commonplaces that even those people that are most kind of identified as the critical thinkers of the state tend to have these kind of commonplace assumptions, that I think our work really helps to undo, so that we can, on the one hand, have a more nuanced, you know, like last week Amelia talked about in part like effective disruptions. Like if we have a better understanding of our opponent, we can disrupt them more effectively. But also because I would assume no one here wants to repeat the mistakes of so-called worker states. So that's a real question, I think, because I do think a lot of people kind of treated the state as something that would just kind of automatically work for them. It would just kind of, it was a machine essentially. I think there's been a lot of interpretations of the state as a machine that haven't really held true over time.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's also interesting what you just said about kind of like Chinese state theory, because one of the things that doesn't really get like Taoism, which often has this kind of like peaceful, was very much like a doctrine of the state, up to and including like there's Taoist war theory and all this stuff. But what you just said about like mode B and the capacity to build both upper and lower limits, like that's literally like as above, so below. Like in a sense, like that's very mode B, that they were saying like you can have in the same conceptual schema a sense of an above and a below. Whereas like by definition, like there'd only be one of those for modes A and mode C. So it really does show that for a long time, mode B thinking has been not only like called Taoism like a static, locked in binarist kind of like thinking, right? But yeah. I'm curious, for my curiosity, like what are some of the things that people they were saying were similar with MST and the homeless movement or landless movement in Guanyin, whatnot? I'm curious, like, what were those things that you saw were overlapping and whatnot? I'm gonna mute myself while the train goes through.
I think the first person who mentioned was actually, I don't remember if it was Victor or Travesi. I don't know if you guys want to take up the question.
If Victor does want to talk about, I can talk about a little bit about that. Well, in MST, the occupations in the year 2000 so were planned to target lands that were neighbors to lands that could be occupied, because in Brazil the movement would target lands that were unproductive. Would be the could be targeted by the law to I don't know the term, to reform, to I forgot how to speak this in English. Reforma agrária.
The agrarian reform.
Knows. Okay, agrarian reform. So there would be a lot of lands neighboring each other that could be targeted as agrarian reform. Then the movement would occupy one land. The police would then be called to take them out of the land, and they would just move to the neighboring land, because it was a land that could be targeted by the movement to agrarian reform too. And then because the police would act only if they were called to do it, not and not act strategically to make the movement weaker, then the movement would just make the police get tired of taking them out of the land, so they could get time to build houses, to make farms and a lot of things. This wasn't like hacking the law by itself, but it was a matter of how the police would act against the movement.
So it was less the different legal statuses, and like basically which one it sounded like was least likely to have someone else call the police to initiate it.
Yes, the person that would call the police would be the landowner mostly.
Okay. So these were privately owned pieces of land that were being occupied, not governmental.
Yes, privately owned.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. That is much further than where we're at in the States. We're getting ready to seize private land. That's really cool that you guys were doing that.
So the homeless movement, I think there's like an analogy in two senses. First, it's like the strategy of the homeless movement. It would be like it's similar to the land. It's actually the same constitutional function, like, that says that land has to have a social use, or it can be taken away for social for for homes or something else. But that applies to, there's like a different interpretations to if it applies only to private land or if it applies to public land that isn't used by anyone. But there's like, if the movement occupied a private land that isn't being used, there is a possibility that it can be used for that land can be used for homes. But it's like what Travessia said, the possibility that the police will come is higher. But in the case of public land, there is like there is land by the municipality, the state, and the federal government. And if you like occupy a land by the federal government, it takes a lot longer for the police to take you out. But you can't stay there. It's not like constitutional to use public land for that group of people. So people would like, if they were removed from one type of land, they would go to another that like federal, and it would take longer. And while they were there, they would like plan to occupy another private land. So it was a way of trying to keep people together. And because if you dissolve the occupation, it's like the organization is gone. So there was that kind of strategy. And also there was something like, when an occupation was going well and like people were in favor of the occupation, like the municipality would say it's the federal government's job to give homes, and the state would say it's the municipalities, and they would like throw the responsibility to one another, and that made things really hard to actually get the land, because because it's a bit confusing in the structure of Brazilian government who is actually responsible for the right to have a home. It depends on who you can put more political pressure on in that case. So
it's a federal constitutional right.
What?
It's a constitutional, like a federal right.
Yeah, it's a federal constitution, but the money is federal, but there's also state money, there's also municipal money, and it is very confusing there's a lot of hacking of the law. It's like it's ultimately a game of political power. If you have enough power, you can live in the land you occupied. If you don't, you can negotiate another land. If you have even less, you get taken out. But a part of that political power is like choosing who you want to fight against. You may choose to fight the municipal or depending on who is easier to negotiate with, or you can throw one against another. Sometimes that happens too. Like there are different political parties in the municipality and the state. So you go to one to promise to give you the land. So the political damage of denying the home is for the municipality, and people buy time with that kind of stuff. You can stay 2 years, 3 years before getting removed.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just to add to what Travessia and what Vitor said, that I think the Brazilian case, because it's very hard to tell the story of landless movement in Brazil without, I mean, the fact that we managed to put it in a constitution, this idea of social property. So it's interesting because you can see, I think, two things at once, that it is a local and global attack on the state, right? I mean, you pass a law that makes it legible in terms of mode B, that there is such a thing as a social use of a property. And so it's a different resolution for the state. It means that the state must be interested in the use of the land, right? You could have a legislation that simply says, whoever owns it, I don't care what they do. But that transformation happens at the level of the law, the constitution. And then there is the occupation that now is not entering a piece of land that is just a property. It's a piece of property that the state also needs to discuss the terms of its use. And then you have leeway. But it's the interesting thing is that if you think of that as a, one strategy that goes to the, it's a midway out strategy. It needs to go into the law and into the land, right, at the same time. But the two things are not compatible. The people who lobby for law and institutional transformation tend to organize in party form, tend to be, debating with the state, try to get elected. Their rhythm and their calendar and everything and their strategies is one thing. Their base, in fact, is not necessarily the base that actually is occupying the land and then votes for them. There's a lot of political acrobatics in Brazil to actually make one thing fit the other, like put everyone in occupations, in buses, and drive them to vote for the candidates who are going to help. But it's not, there is actually contradictions between locally directed and globally directed parts of the same process, So it's not harmonious, even though it's affecting the same thing. And I think it's a good example of this as well, that you could assume that because, the state is meant to be a monolithic thing, that whatever happens at the level of property rights and whatever happens at the level of law and whatever happens at the level of political power, these things kind of converge, but they don't, right? They actually address different political actors and so on. So you get a very weird kind of prism where the people who are working through the strategy to make sure the law is valid and agrarian reform is being debated, they actually take on strategies and forms of organization that might be totally incompatible with the forms of organization and the priorities of people who are actually occupying the land. So, for example, you can have Lula's government discussing, trying to push laws towards, keeping a certain possibility of use of land open by discussing developmental politics, the productive use of land, blah, 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 blah. And then the people who are actually going to occupy the land, are people who might very well protest that particular use of the land itself. So it's not necessarily, the things don't necessarily match up. So it's a very weird process. I think it's not like it's not blocked like the American case where you were describing this as something that seems like the inverse of what Vitor said. Vitor seemed to suggest that there is, because it's different, you can exploit, you can hack the difference between municipality, state, and so on, where the state seems like the fact these things are different actually most of the time protects the state rather than opens holes, right? So I don't know, I think that there is also an interesting kind of point to this as well, like when you stack up all these strategies and what you need to change by the level of the law so that you can actually have political power to kind of front against the city or the state and say, no, but the use of this land, blah, blah, blah. The strategy to get that global change to the local resolution and the struggles to get that local thing to combine with other occupations and so on and build something global, those two processes might not converge, You need to do it on purpose. Like, it's not going to happen automatically.
Yeah, I think that's really good. First off, thanks, Victor and Travesia, for that, as well as Gabriel. That helps a lot. That's really interesting because there's a lot of overlaps and distinctions too. And I know Brazil's federal system is not like ours, but it's somewhat closer to ours than a lot of others. So that's interesting. I want to dig into that more. And I think what you just hit on, Gabriel, was like spot on insofar as going back all the way to Occupy, but you see this in plenty of other movements. You saw similar issues with Black Lives Matter, which is this kind of assumption that precisely like you'll kind of like compose up and then kind of like mass movement down. And as long as you're doing that work, the meeting point is kind of a given. That's always been an assumption. Like when we attempted to have like regional occupies, we just kind of assumed they would just take the form of the local occupies. And it was a disaster. They never, you know, nothing happened there because of it. And like most of the attempts to nationalize Black Lives Matter haven't transformed into anything like in terms of Black Lives Matter. Now, obviously, like the Democrats have been able to wield quite a bit of that national energy and idea, but the capacity to kind of build up has been severely disrupted. And I think that, again, when we look at the United States in particular, the kind of political capture that our two-party system combined with states' rights, combined with the way we vote, where you don't vote for like party lists, you vote for individual candidates on every single election, makes it so not only is it like, you know, we have that challenge in general, but also it's much more difficult to actually kind of like coordinate at that global level. So there's a lot of, I don't think the United States is bereft in like local movements, and there's lots of interesting stuff happening, but I think there's a particular capacity of federalism to do even more disruption to like left-wing politics, precisely because of the particular way that federalism has enabled the capture of political organizations in the US.
This actually also leads me to a question I wanted to ask you about something you presented, because, you know, early on, I was too seduced by all the arrows and the nice words in your like mode A, B, and C in compositions again to mention this. But now I remember that it was not, I mean, it was nice, but I wonder how far we can take it, the way you associated like mode A with unions, B with parties, C with co-ops. Insofar as the tree emerged within capitalism. So it seems like they're all mode C based, not like expressions of, you know, so there's some subtlety there to the fact that mode C is below these things. And I was then thinking about when we talk about scaling up, I have the impression that the underlying thesis of the stuff you presented as a kind of, you know, daydream for the future of revolutionary American politics is that there's actually more power to scale up things by leaning on mode C than, and a mix of mode C and mode A, then leaning on mode B as a sort of, you know, robust structure, because as we've been discussing, mode B seems to be actually the fluid one. And the situation of American federalism suggests that it's precisely because it's this fluid that it can keep kind of air gaps where needed to isolate things, right? So, I mean, I think that there is an interesting debate. Like it appeared again when we're talking about Brazil, that there is this, you know, state politics has a lot to do with recognizing the joints of political power. Like it's not really one state. You have like all these parallel and serial states, you know, with like this overseers and this kind of middle managers that actually, you know, they are real co-limits to state power. They're not just, you know, a manager behind the real boss. That's not true, right? And finding out where the point of cutting comes for a particular issue, it's a big issue, right? So are you going to fight with a municipality, or are you going to fight with state power? Well, that depends on, for that particular point, that particular decision or intervention, what is the proper point of view of the state that you can correlate forces with? And it seemed to me like your claim is that this is so perfected in the United States. Like the mixture. What American federalism is like a very, very well-oiled machine of guaranteeing that the point of view that is effective from the point of view of the state is never in a good correlation of forces with political leftist power. Like whenever you organize, the political power at the level of your organization is always way too much. It has way too much autonomy and power for you to actually partner up and fight with it. Whereas in Brazil, you might, organize some movement in a city that has a leftist mayor. And then he actually wants an autonomy from the state, and he might prevent the state from intervening too much because he wants to also feed off of your movement and so on. So you get like this more complex composition. So
so I'll come to talk a little bit about the three organizations mapped to the modes. Totally. First off, to grant your point, absolutely. Like these all take place in the social world of capital, kind of under the domination of mode C. And I don't think that those three organizations are purely those modes. But if you do look at the actual kind of how, especially before we get into massive quote business unionism and big union bureaucracies, what are the mechanisms by which unions organize? And one way I think is paradigmatic is the kind of social pressure, A, at the moment of forming a union, and B, at the moment of organizing a strike against people that want to keep working, right? There are these moments of kind of essentially communal peer pressure, which have been critical in most union organizing campaigns, most strike campaigns, that there's a kind of communal element. And I think that's part of why at that kind of critical early 1900s juncture, the Wobblies were so effective here in the United States, was because they built a union that really leveraged and was able to disseminate through lots of different immigrant communities throughout the United States.
Who are the Wobblies again?
Oh, sorry, the Industrial Workers of the World.
Okay, sorry. Wobblies.
Anarcho-syndicalists, but that's the major socialist party members were members of the IW. It was a much more than just that, and they leveraged a lot of communal aspects. And so, I just think it's, and there's other ways to parse it up too. There's a lot of other organizational forms, but those three, that was just an attempt to kind of make an argument that different organizational forms sense different kinds of stuff, right? Sense different kinds of social questions and social problems. And I think that connects to the second point around that, because it's not just what the state in the United States prevents us from doing, it's also sensing things, right? I think there's so much of an ideology about the United States as a young country that we forget that it's the United States government is one of the oldest extant governments on the planet at the moment. It's got one of the largest, most labyrinthine bureaucracies. It's been standing more or less since 1783 or whatever. Even with the Civil War, it was never once ended. So it's just got a huge amount of bureaucracy, and beyond that, I think very real capacities to learn and adapt. I think the machinery of it is quite smart, but I think it's also got a lot of interfaces again with chambers of commerce and lots of the kind of organizations of the bourgeois per se, the country club elite structure. So there's a lot of that. But sorry, it's kind of vague there. But I know Victor had your hand raised. I don't know if you still got things.
I was gonna ask, when the occupation created the consul camp, did the consul camp not because I had an experience like that in we either have the General Assembly as an effective body, or we have the everyday coordinators from each square, in the homeless movement at least. It was either one or another, and you managed to combine the two, and if there were any conflicts between the Council Camp and the General Assembly that happened, or how was it solved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a few different ways. It came down to like just a network of folks that were pretty committed to the idea, I think was really a large part of it. So that there were people who were more kind of ensconced with the activist General Assembly kind of crowd that like were also deeply like a lot of us that drove it were involved in like the nighttime de-escalation. So we saw like all the stuff of the camp at its worst. But that's also where we built a lot of trust amongst the homeless folks there. And I think that was a big part of it, is that a lot of the activists actually didn't have the trust of the people living at the camp, because they felt like the people living at the camp felt like they were just disrespected, I guess, essentially, that they couldn't feel like seen in a very real way. But there was also like a lot of, and I don't know, I think these kind of populations change a lot depending on where you are, but there's just a vast amount of mental health issues, huge, and addiction issues amongst our the homeless population. So there was a commitment of a few homeless folks to really like those camp council meetings were crazy. They weren't like organized, they were wild meetings. And the first meeting, this guy that was the main homeless leader of it was literally on his knees begging people to like take their turn and not yell at each other. And like Randy would just do all these, like, it was crazy, but like he would put himself in the middle of these conflicts and like get people to like chill out. And like I feel that's where it's like there's like the formal dimension where you have to know what it is that like you want to do, but also we happen to have some really great people. Like there were some really good, solid activists, some of whom were very experienced, some of whom, like myself, I'd never really done much organizing before, but like I learned from good people and stuff. And there was a ton of new activists, including folks from the homeless population. And I think since we kind of had some collective experience here to kind of teach, that was a big role of it. And I think also, and I know we've talked about this a little bit one-on-one, Victor, like the politics of like left-wing activists and stuff. I think most of those folks had like burned bridges so quickly in the beginning that no one trusted them, so they couldn't be as like Machiavellian as they wanted to be. So they kind of burned their own. So there was a combination of good ideas and fortuitous, like we had some really good people working, and a lot of the worst activists had like self-neutralized themselves by being too opportunistic, obviously. So we had like some good luck there. And then, but yeah, honestly, we didn't have many conflicts as a result between the two. Once they got stabilized, people in the General Assembly were glad not to have to talk about cleaning up the camp, and people in the camp were glad not to have to like wait for 4 hours to figure out whether or not they could like take the porta potties out. So it just solved so many problems that, and we had so many people behind it that we didn't have a chance for conflict. But also within a month, the cops had to shut down. So would there have been conflict if we'd been there 6 months? Almost certainly. And I have no clue what that would look like, unfortunately.
You know, this reminds me, I think that this would warrant, I'm tempted to invite him. I wonder if he would be up for coming. He already joined us a long time ago in a meeting, a guy called Crisanto. He was from the popular housing movement in Curitiba. And I think I mentioned him before a long time ago. I spent a while in their the occupation that they were organizing in Curitiba. And one thing that they did that I think that now, I mean, this is a really good kind of, I just feel like your example is such a good kind of way for us to restrict a study to this type of thing, which is the division of coordinated bodies inside movements, and when they solve problems, and when that actually stabilizes. So when internal division stabilizes and prevents external division, right? Mm-hmm. Because what they did is the craziest thing. Like they were like 4 lawyers. They organized. They were part of SOL at the time. and of MST, the landless movement, but they organized this occupation. But they were also very weird, erudite Maoists, and they had a thesis that they wanted to explore, which was the thesis that the Bible is the only universal book in Brazil, because it's the book that intellectuals study, but it's a book that everyone knows kind of by heart, passages of it. So their thesis was that the Old Testament is a book about mass organization. So they studied for years the Old Testament as a book of leaders leading masses throughout the desert and solving problems and so on. So what did they do? They did two things in their occupation. The first is that they created a church, but the role of the church was for people who were, had a really serious problem with addiction to go inside the church. And for people who were busy with prostitution and something like this, to do it in the church, because it was sacred space. So nobody could do anything against them there, but they wouldn't do it anywhere else. And the second thing they did is that they put together theater plays based on the Old Testament to stage political decisions that they wanted to talk in the occupation, but they couldn't, like, it would make no sense to discuss them in political terms because it just sounded foreign to the people. So they tried to find passages in the Old Testament that if you were to debate that decision, it would put into question a decision that they also needed to make. So they did this it lasted for 3 years, the occupation. They had a bunch of other problems, but the time that I was around them was, really, really enlightening, and they were a really weird bunch of people. But I think that, and I know he likes STP, so I could see if he wants to come in. But I think it's just, like, very interesting general issue of that we could focus on, like, Fatma sent us like a.
Yeah, I just wanted to check in at some point if you wanted to, if you just want to keep it textual, that's fine, Fatima. But if you want,
if you want to just.
I don't know. It's just that I think that's an easier way for me to try to deliver the most possible clear thought that I can make. So I don't know, maybe you can take a look and share your thoughts.
Yeah, let me just read real quick and I'll get back to it. I really like that mirror thing. So it seems like, these were pretty big camps then, or occupations. They were the basis of general strikes. Were these pretty large? I have to admit ignorance on this.
Yeah, I think maybe sometime soon we should prepare a light presentation on what happened in Lebanon in October. But basically, it started with like very violent demonstrations that lasted for like 3 or 4 days continuously, with continuous confrontations with the army and the riot control in different cities and villages, and then the banks like closed and the crisis deteriorated more, and we're in the slope since then. So what happened is that a lot of people stayed in the streets homeless people, militants, activists, people from the Lebanese Communist Party or from the feminist groups. And they were like their social, and of course they come like from different social stratas, and they were socializing with other people who like suddenly got homeless because like there's 250,000 jobs that like people lost during the first months of the crisis. Like it was that big. So like there is a whole bunch of people who were in the streets, and yeah, they slept there. I'm not like I haven't studied or like thought enough of how people were organizing their relations there, but like the vibe is that it was bad. So it failed this dramatically, and like in Tripoli, it's interesting because after these political tents were gone, there were these food carts of poor people who were trying to make their daily living, you know. And it turned to this kind of space, and then it was easier to just crash it down. So yeah, I'm interested in how we can think of political organization within very like fiery moment of occupation, of uprising, of yeah, the event happening. And yeah, I think these were the points in general. Yeah, you talked about the intentional randomness and the counterproductive randomness, and like in the Lebanese context, this was related a lot to like, of course, this resentment caused by the civil war and the depressed left in general, and yeah, the absence of political organization. There's like only the traditional Communist Party, but there's no alternative that has been productive lately. And all of these political organizations were like very young. They were formed during this political event. So it was the zero moment for them. Yeah, I lost my train of thoughts, but I think what was it like? So yeah, this counterproductive randomness that was like, to me, I sensed it was like imposed, like we are collectively democratically going to choose that we hate leadership. And it was like kind of weird. And yeah, this of course limited a lot the discussion around what is to be done institutionally, to say. And yeah, there was a very interesting role played by the lawyers during then. They were organized during in a collective, so they were following up each case of how to say, like when you of arrests and so on. And they were communicating with the media, and yeah. So yeah, this institutional aspect is usually limited to corruption and to reform and to technocratic discourse. So yeah, I'm interested in how we can, as Marxists, articulate, because I think this has to do a lot with thinking of a political program during a social movement, of defining the urgent demands and then the long-term strategy. And I don't know, yeah, so yeah, I rambled. I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, thank you. That was not rambly, especially with the baseline that I established. So I appreciate that. That's a lot to process. So I mean, I can see why it's like feels like a lot, because that's a very large scale phenomenon, it seems like, and I'm gonna have to do my due diligence and do some more research on this in a bit. But I think a few things really struck me in that, which is, first off, like this recurring issue from the last, let's say 10, 15 years of like the relationship between not trusting leaders for very good reasons, oftentimes. And it's somewhat striking, like when I hear stories. I know some leftists in Turkey, and I've talked to some of the comrades here from Brazil, and it's really interesting how similar opportunism in the left looks around the world. It's so cliche and stupid. But yeah, I mean, the connection you're making between that and then like the overall shutdown of conversations around institutions and creativity. And I really appreciate, I don't know who shared it, but that one quote from someone about like the art of the law of institutions versus the law of value. It seems like a really creative way to talk about it, because I think one of the things, and I don't know about Lebanon, I know here in the States, and it seems similar dynamics in Brazil, like there's so much personality culture in politics, whether it's on the left or in mainstream politics. And I think one of the benefits of taking a more systematic institutional point of view is you like create an alternative to the personalism of politics right now. I think you also give people, like what you're saying, like the relationship between forming a political program in the moment of a social movement. For me, a lot of that, like during Occupy, there was so much like emphasis on what do you guys want, what do you do, what are your demands, frame that. And I think part of the problem with that was one of our major demands was that we have enough time to figure out what our demands were. Like one of our major demands was that we be given enough breathing room from the police and the media and the trolls to be able to figure out our shit enough to then figure out how to give you a nice little summary of how to fix the problems of one of the most capitalist nightmare nations on the planet. So like, I think fighting for space and time to think, to create, to experiment, to process is something that has to be politically articulated, and is very difficult in our current state to, I think, just put down. Not only because like, you know, the army and the police are coming to crash your occupation, but also because, especially in our current political culture, people want like fast, immediate, like nicely circumscribed answers. And I think one of the things that like Marxism in general and STP in particular really offers is, on the one hand, it makes clear that, but on the other hand, it actually gives us tools to experiment and try things out during the social movements, to actually try things in the moment. And so I think in order to develop a political program in the midst of a social movement, we have to have methodologies in place that look a lot like experimental methodology, right? Like, how do we do an experiment? How do we track it? How do we talk about it? Because we're not going to come up with a nice political program the first time, but we might get there if we have the space to like process and work over and like, you know, synthesize it collectively. Because one of the things that like, I really love this Small Mirrors saying, I'm the leader of the revolution. The only issue I take with that is when push comes to shove, everyone suddenly seems to want someone else to be the leader all of a sudden. When things get nasty, when things get bad, then suddenly I found in Occupy, people weren't nearly as against leaders all of a sudden. And I think that there's like some real questions about that, that role of like taking responsibility as things go bad. It's kind of a cliche, but you know, demoralization happens after defeat. And I think part of what STP offers is a way, again, to kind of like say, okay, we got defeated, but we actually got to like test out and learn some things. Like Occupy was defeated, but we learned some things that have carried on to other movements. This October 2019 was defeated, but it's it sounds like things have continued to grow and come out of that. So like, how do we actually, I remember this is one of the first things Gabriel brought up when I first joined STP, was just like, we're constantly losing the lessons of the past. We have no way to like actually kind of hold together like what we're learning collectively. And yeah, this is all, speaking of rambling, here's ramble on like why I think that yeah, we can develop programs if we kind of have this experimental approach, and it's a truly democratic experimentalism that we're keeping people involved. Gabriel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something, because I think what Fatima brought up and the way that it connects with what you are bringing up, and also with discussions I've had with Vitor and Hanzo, and about, let's say, recent things in Brazilian politics. It's just that, I mean, even more than that, like we had a meeting with the students from Vienna who were occupying that place, and a lot of what they had to tell us was, again, it's something it's a repetition, if we're going to be a bit analytic, which is, for some reason, exactly as you said, like there is something that the question that the state poses of what do you want from me, it's so demoralizing for politics in the last 15 years, where it looks like you should have a better answer, but at the same time, the moment that you try to figure out a better answer, you already lose something in the process. And I think that one thing that we've been discussing recently, focusing on courier strikes in Brazil, for example, is that there is a movement where you already lose a certain battle. The moment that the state says, okay, send us some representatives to debate, and then a movement that didn't have those representatives clearly chosen is obliged to take on that structure so they can send somebody. And the moment that you did this, is like you intoxicated the movement with a structure that wasn't organically created in it. So you on the surface, you are receiving people to talk, but on the underground, you're actually sending a form into the movement, right? And now it needs to have, like, and we've seen this recently where leftist political parties were privy to this. They helped to codify, like, Vitor, I'm thinking about just the way Gallo suddenly appeared inside that meeting in Brasilia via the Saul mediating his presence there. And it actually intensified a conflict amongst the couriers, not because of people. It was a form, like it just chose a leader or a representative, while there was so much work being done not to make that so crystallized and so on. So there's this one thing which I think it's interesting, but I think it goes to a bigger point, and I didn't really think about it that clearly until today, because I think that, for example, I've been talking to Fatima about this, and I see that it seems to make sense in more than one context. Like in Brazil, I think that this is more or less clear. Like when Vitor and I talk about this, I can see that there is a kind of a story that goes from 2013 and this large protests, large revolts, all the way to the idea today. And I think that we are part of that idea of saying, yeah, perhaps rethinking what organization means is necessary, because things that looked like they were disorganized actually had some form, and we didn't manage to deal with that form very well. So we need to rethink this. And I think that this is a big motivation. The idea that we don't always know what is political organization in a situation just by looking at which flag is up. Political parties might be very conservative, even though they have a leftist discourse, and like, people just trying to get by might be doing something that is actually like going against the current the most in a situation. So again, it's a way of looking at the form of how people are organizing rather than just trusting explicit signs. But what I'm catching now that perhaps is an interesting way of also framing what we're doing is that what do leaders, coordinators, presidents, whatever do? Like it's a way of putting something to stand in the place of this synthetic point so that you can see the whole that you're in, right? So when somebody's a leader of something, I mean, in practice, we know that they cannot come up with things alone. They're actually coming up with things that they're picking up around them, and then they chew it, send it back. If it fits reality minimally, or at least part of reality, it sticks. If they're just coming up with it out of the blue, it won't stick, right? But for some reason, which has a lot to do, in my opinion, with complexity, integrating information, synthesizing a point of view, and so on, we kind of need those funnels. And I mean, that's a very kind of classic point that Bogdanov makes when he says, like, yeah, leaders and commanders, they are like very rudimentary ways of seeing your own organization. Like, you cannot see it by looking around, but if you look at that one person, you can see the place you're in. But there are other ways of doing it, like norms is a way of, if I follow a norm, I'm already looking at my behavior and at other people's behaviors from an organized point of view and not just my own. And I have the impression that what we're also doing, and it might be, let's say, there might be a good way of historically discussing this, is I think there is a wager that if people, there is a kind of sensibilization to organizational forms that can lower the need to look at specific people. Because the more heterogeneous, the more polymorphous these forms are, the harder it is to find leaders. Not because so the whole discourse of do we want or don't we want leaders? Like, it doesn't matter if you want or if you don't. If we did want leaders, it wouldn't work. They wouldn't be able to synthesize things. And if we don't want leaders, it's also not going to work, because it's not, that's not a political position. Like, it's not going to work anyway. You're still going to have to coordinate. So you just need like a way of looking at the coordinating level. So it's a phenomenology, like a way of seeing what you're doing that doesn't, you can have leaders for some specific things, but you can still see the things you're part of by looking at other things. So I have the impression that there are three things we know to look at to measure organization: leaders, humanitarian leaders, charismatic leaders, that's mode A. Norms and protocols, laws. You look at the law, you see the whole blah, blah, blah. And money. You look at money, you stop thinking about immediate surroundings, and you look at actually the whole world, right? Like, what do I need to make money? How can I make money? It's a question that already involves like hundreds of thousands of people, and you're trying to guess what they want from you. You automatically are removed from your individual perspective, right? And I think that there is a claim we're making with our whole objective phenomenology that organizations in general, they can also be something like that. You should be able to look at how you're relating to people, and we should be able to we should also include in our concerns constructing something that can serve as a way of looking back at yourself and seeing yourself from that collective perspective, right? So I have the impression that that's where the model, you can see the political value of modeling, because, for example, if I ask somebody in the occupation that you were describing that went through a process of scission and dividing into two councils, right? And I ask, why did you divide into two councils? The answer will not be individual. The answer will have to describe a group dynamic. So if you look at that scission, it's like looking at money, it's like looking at a norm, and it's like looking at a leader. You're looking at something that will return to you like a group description. You see my point? Like, I think that there is an underlying wager in what we're doing that we never really explore very well, but I think it's always here in one way or another, which is that we're kind of claiming that there are specific organizational processes that sometimes appear as scissions, but I think that the property that they all share is just being, to be formally, like these weird co-limits, right? But they're not co-limits in the sense that they coincide on a person, but in the sense that they're small models of a bigger thing. But the small model can be a meeting, doesn't need to be a person. Like,
Yeah.
there's definitely a sense in which S2P has leaders, S2P has norms, and S2P also has the capacity for us to expend time and effort in what we do. But how do you call the little monster we develop? Like, you look at it and you see a bunch of people's research, right? Or a Monday meeting is a small model of a bunch of conversations. So the idea that you can synthesize a big collective process, not on a person or a norm or a money, but you can synthesize it on, for example, a set of 3 meetings that always happen every week. Like that can also function like money functions, you know? I think that there's something about this that is promising in the sense that you want leaderless politics. That means you want a politics that you are always looking for what is modeling your situation inside that situation. What part of the situation reflects back the whole of the situation, right? And
Yeah.
if you democratize that know-how of looking at your political situation and finding the part that reflects back the whole situation back to you, you don't need leaders to do all that work. They might help with something like coordinating the time of meeting. Can somebody choose the time of meeting? Then somebody raise their hand and say, let's meet at 5, and just end of the conversation, right? But like, you can empty out those synthetic functions and separate them and ask for which processes are norms the better synthetic point of view, for which processes are local leaderships better than norms, for which processes are, you know, exchange rates between like effort and a good the militometer, the militometer. We have this expression in Portuguese, like when we measure who suffers the most, you know, doing militant work. But in some sense, some other things do that, right? And I think that this is your example is also an example of that, like the example of this internal division of an organ of struggle into 2, right?
Yeah.
When you look at that division, you're looking at something bigger, which is a tension inside the occupation between reproduction and transformation, something like this, right? Yeah, so I just think that there is also, I never thought about this, but like, in a certain sense, this is an educational process. Like, imagine, you know, adding into like the formation of militants the idea that they shouldn't only be talking about, you know, centralization under hierarchical chains of commands, which might make sense in a party for some things, but or norms that you need to follow, or situations where, you know, looking at the political economy of the situation is valid, but also this kind of general sensibility for, which might appear as a problem, like, you know, a split, and then you need to use that split to look back at your movement, or something that is actually more constructive, like a decision we took in the heat of the moment about creating a camp council. Like, nobody's thinking theoretically about it, but after you've done it, you can look at that and it looks back at you, right? It tells us something about what we're doing. So yeah, I don't know, I think there's a very practical aspect, you know, to this phenomenological thing there. And it seems historically correct that a moment, you know, that most people who are here in this meeting have been dealing with political processes where you see that there's something true in the lack of leadership. It's not a fake idealistic thing. It's signaling something real. Like, it's not really the best way to discuss some things, but we still need to look somewhere to see what we're doing, and we don't have the name for that yet, right? We're kind of lost in between.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways what you just described seems really close to like MOD itself, right? Like, where we actually begin to treat the organizational structure itself as the mediator. And actually, I won't name drop the fellow, but someone from a more, let's say, traditional Marxist-Leninist party attended the other day, and we were discussing a lot of like our internal organizational processes. And this fellow said, I would also like to ask if the ideas to allow for different forms of organizing and structures to be developed and measuring them against each other, wouldn't you have to settle on some continuity of quote unquote best practices at some point? Something that's been practiced and observed to work in multiple contexts. I think we've probably all heard this argument from some Trotskyist or Marxist-Leninist group or whatever, that like the testing's already been done. We've already determined what the best forms are. Why the fuck can't you like get this in your head? The science is complete. Do the form.
German idealism has been complete.
Yeah, right. Like they've come. We have absolute organizational method, and so anyway, we've all dealt with that. But I think that that's like the flip side of exactly what you're talking about, Gabriel, is like that resistance to actually treating the organizational form as the experimental material itself, to kind of like fetishistically and scientistically treat the existing forms as already kind of like validated. Because my experience of a Trotskyist group that made these kind of arguments, they had no actual techniques to measure success. In fact, whenever we lost, it's because of the objective conditions, and whenever we won, it was because of the brilliance of the leadership, right? Like every single time.
Be right back,
So,
guys.
I'll go. Yeah. So I think one of the things STP is doing that's really important is when we talk about measuring, testing methods and ideas, we actually need a methodology, right? Like one of the breakthroughs of the period between like Descartes and Newton was going from natural philosophy to physics, was the process of actually coming up with an experimental method that you could test against, and like a formalism that held. And I agree with Renzo was here briefly, but took off. But he mentioned in one of our logic chats that it seems like our modes are a kind of axiomatization of social science, and that's, I totally agree with that. I think we're like formalizing a lot of like actual social science, and that comes with the capacity to actually frame and methodologize, to provide methodology for experiments, right? So in a sense, like we just haven't had the right tools, like the adequate tools. Like there were, brilliant natural philosophers for literally thousands of years, but once like mathematical physics came along, it blew it out of the water in a very short period of time. And I'm not saying this particular group of human beings here right now, but I'm saying like this practice taken at large could really like have the same kind of effect, where we actually have the means to measure, to track, to test against other ideas. Because I totally agree with the classic scientific socialist idea that there are better and worse ways and we should figure it out through practice. But I've also had my like life scorched earthed by like Marxist Leninists who were like so divisive or so dogmatic that they didn't care like what they broke, as long as their cherished method kept going. So, and I sounds like similar dynamics with the CP in Lebanon. I know that talking to several folks, it's similar in Brazil. So like actually differentiating dogma from experimental method is what I take to be precisely what Gabriel was just emphasizing. That's the only way that you can actually begin to mediate. Hope everything's good, Gabriel. That's the only way you can actually begin to mediate organizational form itself, and not just leaders, norms, or money. And that is precisely norms. When these Marxist-Leninist groups say this is how scientific socialism is done, that's not scientific, that's normative, which is fine in and of itself, but that is what that is. So I think Gabriel is absolutely right. Like norms are one of those places that we kind of like localize on to position these things and to orient ourselves and to make sense of stuff. But unfortunately, a lot of times on the left, we mistake norms for actual like scientific tested ideas. So that's the answer, Gabriel. I hope things are good on your end. You just had to duck out for some stuff. So, which in general, I just want to check in. We've been going for close to 3 hours, so I'm happy to keep going. But I just wanted to give that. I know at least some of the folks are way later than I am right now. So. on the West Coast, so it's still very early for me.
Yeah, I have to go pretty soon, but yeah, lots of things to further discuss here. I guess like given what you just said, the goal seems to be we need to like disseminate this methodology. First, actually, we need to make it a more rigorous or make it more accessible, right? As a methodology. What exactly are we saying, constitutes an experiment, and how, and given the results of an experiment, how do we, collate or combine the information, right? So it would be interesting to really just write that out like, explicitly. What is that? What do we think that is? Also, I think that is where the formalism is helpful a bit, because there's a lot of research on the concept of learning, and the thing you have indicated with open learners and this telcat category. And I think there's some other competing ones too, right? Like I think in the applied category theory community, it's all about this, how to combine different formalisms or different patterns of learning together. So I don't know if you wanted to maybe speak on that.
So speaking on how we kind of use those formalisms to model how we compose things politically.
Yeah, I guess like well, if the end product of STP is like a methodology, how does the formalism fit in with that methodology? And then and like what's the final thing we give to people? But because it's we're asking a lot when we have all these meetings every week, it's difficult to ask someone to follow all these meetings. We need to have, and we do this sometimes with our text, right? We write a text where we kind of elaborate the methodology, but it seems a bit, you have to kind of read between the lines, I feel like, in our text. So how do you envision the more concise way of describing it would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them would be to continue to work through examples like Fatima bringing up what happened in Lebanon, and Travesia and Victor talking about MST. Like, how can we take some of the ideas I've presented here, and there have been plenty of other attempts to model this formally. I think a lot of like Renzo's topological mapping of the school occupations. I think we still have to kind of work through cases more and to see where like where the commonalities keep going and where things break in terms of like generality, and scale things too, right? Like Occupy, for example, came in large response to what happened in the Arab Spring. It would be a mistake to equivocate between the intensity or the scale of the two, right? But they're clearly interconnected, and trying to push our, like, I think so internally before we even get to external, like pushing our formalisms more and trying to really add more cases. I don't know. I tend to think like, I mean, not everyone's going to want to learn the formalisms, but I think a lot more people are going to be interested, not necessarily in like the strict category theory, but I think in the three diagrams of like organizational Trinitarianism, the basics of the modes, and the kind of like diagram for social mediation. I think those diagrams kind of stand on their own ground, and maybe we can combine them in ways I did like with the register and stuff. But I think, yeah, I like, this is a terrible example because it's from the exact opposite end of the political spectrum, but the counterinsurgency manual by the US Army for the suppression of insurgency in Iraq is a really good manual for political organization. It's a nightmare for what it represents, but it gives a really good example of how you break up topics, not in terms of like the concepts, but in terms of like the practical activity. And again, kind of like what Amelia was saying last week, there's a lot of examples from bourgeois science and especially from military science on these things that we could learn from. Obviously, we got to critique it and engage with it. But I mean, there's a lot that's just useful in writing a manual that you can just take. I think the question of like teaching category theory, teaching logic, like how much we should offer that is still very open. I tend to think we should lean into it, but I also don't have the time to volunteer lean into it either at the moment. So like that's kind of up in the air. But yeah, so I think presenting the formalisms fairly directly would work. I think coming up with more case examples to present throughout any kind of like manual like text, and you know, to keep like I was gone for like 4 months. I've come back to like a lot of new faces, so and that's only like there it seems like there are more people in the last half year than there were in like the couple years before then. Maybe that's an impression, but I just think like as this continues to grow, just kind of like, I mean, this is really banal and trite, but like keeping the conversation going will help to kind of like, because there are people coming in and learning the formalisms, right? So I think just in continuing to listen to people as they come in, does this make sense to you? How are you using this? What struck you? What doesn't make sense? Like that'll also be important. Because our target audience, I don't think is necessarily going to be, quote, everyone, at least at the beginning. It's going to be like, let's be honest, kind of jaded, cynical leftists that have been burned a lot and are trying to figure out how to keep fighting the fight after like lots of defeats. And I think kind of focusing on that and like presenting in that direction could actually be a really fruitful way to organize it. Sorry, that was blah, 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 but that was the idea.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I have nothing to add to that, but definitely, yeah, let's keep discussing this. And I think you brought up a lot of good points, and especially this idea of comparing experiences. I feel like we're reaching that stage where that's more and more productive to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's productive, and also, I mean, this is just like a personal thing, so I don't know what it's you know, just taking into account of everything else, like this thing, what happened in Eugene has been like on my mind for like a decade-ish now, you know? And so getting to like talk about it in this group and archive it to a certain extent is in and of itself like a really nice, like cathartic thing for me. And I think like I've noticed that with other people in this group is like there is something kind of like that helps in that process. And I think there's something to take beyond this group in that, like, I think there's a weird dialectic between like the politics of creating institutions and having the freedom and a certain kind of like communal seeness, witnessing even. Again, for the materialist Christians, like the early days of confession weren't to a priest, they were like a circle of people talking together. And I feel like there's something like there's a lot of pain and trauma in being an activist. And I'm not saying activist spaces should be therapeutic spaces, like those need to be different places, but there is something transformative in like talking these things through that I don't think should be underestimated.
Yeah, man, I think that this is something we really should. I mean, we've been slowly talking about it, but it's definitely a constant that there is a weird, I mean, Henzo, I remember talking about this aspect too, that there's a weird therapeutic aspect to this. But I think that it, I mean, it's exactly, I mean, it's not exactly, but it's kind of how transference works. Transference is not about identification. Transference is about, let's say, you find a form that is at the same level as the thing you want to treat, and then you get to touch the thing that happened in the past now, right? So you're traumatized because something happened in your past in a love relationship, like a familiar thing with one person. Then you enact a continuation of that with someone else, and then you get to touch on something that happened on the past as if it's still present, right? So it makes sense that if you find a collective that, you know, can enact as if you're still dealing with the same question as back then, that you can also touch on as if that thing can get worked through, you know? Mm-hmm. Like there is something to this that I think we're still trying to understand a bit. And yeah, no, it's always, one way or another, I always go back to this. It's a very interesting point. Okay, guys, should we call it a day?
I think so. I really appreciate everyone bringing all these thoughts and the shares from people of experiences elsewhere and everything. And you know, I'm hoping maybe at the meeting at the end of the month, we can kind of bear some of this in mind when we're talking about actual organization stuff, like what kind of keeping methodology in mind looks like. Would be interesting.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what I presented, but just in general, like the stuff.
Definitely.
So yeah, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure to kind of process all this stuff, and really appreciate you all's feedback. And it's a healthy space, which is rare nowadays. So thank you all very much.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ah, o Germano!